Hello and welcome back! Today we're continuing our study of Shakespeare's complete works, one work at a time. And today we're looking at one of the most obscure and least studied of all of the plays at least partially attributed to Shakespeare. How's that for an intro? We're looking at Sir Thomas More. Now, if you have a complete works of Shakespeare, it probably doesn't contain this play. If you're lucky, it contains one scene from this play, which is the one scene that they're pretty sure Shakespeare wrote. There's also a couple other sections that are probably Shakespeare's as well. And so it's unlikely that you've sat down and read this whole play through on your own, unless you're the biggest Shakespeare nerd ever, like me! A little bit completionist here. But studying this play is absolutely fascinating, not only because it shows us another example of Shakespeare's writing, but also it shows us a whole lot about playwriting and the censorship process in England during this time. Most of the time when we get a Shakespeare play, we get it in its completion. Sure, there's a lot that goes into the editing of a Shakespeare edition, especially because you have to judge between quartos and the folios and all of those details, which I've talked about in other videos. But still, more or less, every other Shakespeare play we get in its more finalized form. Maybe we get a bad copy of it, but more or less we get the full form, after it's been written, edited, and probably performed. Sir Thomas More, on the other hand, is a play in the process of being written. It's a manuscript. Not only that, but it has notes written all over it from several different people. It actually wasn't originally written by Shakespeare. Shakespeare just had a hand in the revision of this play. It was originally written by a man named Anthony Munday, and perhaps Henry Chettle. After the manuscript was completed, Munday submitted the play to Edmund Tilney, who was the master of revels and in charge of censoring plays and making sure that they were appropriate for public consumption. He censored this play very heavily, chopping out huge sections of the text that he thought were inappropriate. I'll talk about why in just a moment. What happened to the draft next is unclear. It seems that Chettle, at least, began to revise, trying to fix some of those parts that were problematic. Sometime later, maybe several years later, the revision process continued, and several other playwrights added pieces to it. There's one person, who is known as Hand C because they can't identify who it actually was, who seemed to be in charge of the process of revision, and requesting different revisions from different people. Other than the revisions by Henry Chettle, there are also revisions by probably Thomas Dekker, Thomas Hayward, and William Shakespeare. Each of these people either rewrote a scene, or part of a scene, or maybe made additions to a scene that already existed. And the manuscript, as we have it, is this mishmash of drafts. The original Munday draft, with some pages missing, with other sections pasted over certain sections, and new pages added in to replace scenes. It is, in other words, a rough draft that's been censored once and has been halfway revised. Did this play ever get finished and actually performed? We don't even know. At this point, the play actually is an entire text. It is just the draft of a text. If this play were performed, this would have been probably resubmitted to a scribe who would then rewrite the whole thing and submit it for censorship again. In other words, it's a goldmine of understanding how plays were written at this time. Not just by Shakespeare, but by several playwrights. It shows the interplay and revision process that went into a lot of playwriting. It shows the cooperation among playwrights. Something that we've discovered about a lot of Shakespeare's plays is that he didn't write the entire thing. For example, Henry VI Part 1, which we've attributed to Shakespeare for years, probably only contains one real scene that Shakespeare wrote. Other plays, like Two Noble Kinsmen, are clearly only half Shakespeare's. There are certainly plenty of plays that Shakespeare wrote in their entirety, but there are also plenty of plays that Shakespeare only contributed to. And Sir Thomas More shows us what such a contribution process would really look like. In that way, it's absolutely fascinating. Aside from reading it as an interesting vision into the drafting and revision process, it's also a fascinating play in the problems that it examines. Sir Thomas More is a history play, and yet it doesn't focus primarily on a royal, on a king. Instead, it focuses on Sir Thomas More, who is famous for having written Utopia. He was a sheriff of London for a while, and also later Lord Chancellor. But ultimately, he ran afoul of Henry VIII and was executed. The reason for his decline and fall stems from his Catholicism and his refusal to sign the articles that allowed Henry VIII to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. This problem led to a lot of tension later on between Catholics and Protestants. And after all, this play was originally written during the reign of Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII. And it's really dangerous to criticize your ruling orders. That was one of the big problems that Tilney had with the play, causing him to censor it. He did not want Munday or the other playwrights to refer specifically to the articles that Henry VIII had put there. In fact, Henry VIII is never specifically named. He's only called the King. According to the ardent Shakespeare, the fact that a lot of revisions did not fully reflect the censorship that Tilney put on the play shows that maybe this play was revised later, after the end of Elizabeth's reign, in the middle of King James' reign. Other than the articles, the other aspect that Tilney particularly focused his censorship on was the first third of the play, which deals with a large insurrection. Tilney felt uncomfortable with showing insurrection, and Shakespeare certainly had shown insurrection in some of his other plays as well, and there was always some tension with that. Notice the historical events around Richard II. One particular performance of Richard II and the uprising against a king was particularly focused on Exeter's rising. You can go back and watch my video over Richard II to explore that more in depth. And Tilney did not want that performed. He specifically wrote on the play, "Leave out the insurrection wholly, and the cause thereof, and begin with Sir Thomas More at the mayor's sessions, with a report afterward of his good service being done Sheriff of London, upon a mutiny against the Lombards. Only a short report, and not otherwise, at your own perils." The insurrection stemmed from xenophobia, the fear of strangers. There was a lot of aliens living in London at the time. In fact, there was a lot of aliens living in London during the writing of this play. And that tension between the traditional English and, in Sir Thomas More's time, the Lombards, but in Anthony Munday's time, the Dutch and French, led to anger, prejudice, injustice, and violence. In the play, they mention the French and the Dutch many times, which is something of an anachronism. If the play had been performed after Anthony Munday wrote it, his audience would have been familiar with the tensions towards the French and the Dutch. As foreigners, Tilney went and marked through several references to French and Dutch, and replaced them with Lombards, which have been more historically accurate, and also less of a powder keg for the current day. It's the same sort of thing that we see throughout history. A lot of the Londoners felt tension toward the foreigners. They're taking our jobs! They're after our women! They're a bunch of thieves and rapists! I'm not even making that up. In the opening scenes, Munday draws a picture of London in which some of the Londoners feel specific tensions towards certain of these Lombards, particularly a man named Debard, and another named Cavalier. Cavalier steals Williamson's doves that he just bought at the market, and Debard tries to steal Doll Williamson, but she puts up a good fight. And the Londoners complain that every time they talk to the authorities about these foreigners, the authorities just side with these Lombards. Here they are stealing our women, stealing our stuff, and getting away with it. We need to do something about it. And so a man named Lincoln begins to lead this group against these foreigners. Rise up against the strangers, let's clean our land out of these foreigners. Although Munday seems to show some sense that these complaints are justified, Shakespeare's later scene and his speech that he writes for Thomas More that ultimately stops this uprising is a lot more sympathetic and rational towards these strangers. Another reason why potentially the revisions seem to have happened sometime afterwards, and why some scholars think that they happened during the reign of King James, is that these xenophobic tensions were much less prevalent. Munday himself is a bit of a problematic person. He is writing this play which seems to lionize or champion a Catholic figure, even though Protestantism was definitely the word of the day in Elizabethan England. We're Protestants and we're proud of it. And yet Sir Thomas More is something of a hero here. His inability to bend in his faith is seen as both honorable and unfortunate at the end of this play. Does Munday sympathize with Catholics? It's awfully hard to tell, because Munday was one of those Aaron Burr kind of characters, who sometimes seemed like he was for you, and sometimes seemed like he was against you, whichever way the wind happened to blow. He both had some involvement in torturing Catholics, and he also had some sympathetic things to say about Catholics at times. He's a wishy-washy. It doesn't take away from some of the complexity of the character of Sir Thomas More within this play. Sir Thomas More is not an action hero. He's a humanist, scholarly hero, which is a different kind of hero from a lot of the history plays that we look at in Shakespeare's other work. Sir Thomas More wins us over on the page by his speeches, and by his humanitarianism. He cares about the poor. He's got a really great sense of humor. So much so that he's even willing to joke while being executed. He's kind, compassionate, and funny, and big-hearted, and he doesn't stir from his beliefs. Even though there's a bit of a tension from the beginning of the play to the end, there's the tension between justice and rightness and authority. If the king does something that's unjust, but he is the authority, should we still honor him as the authority? Or should we fight against him for justice? There's something of a valid complaint to some of the things that happen to the people at the beginning of the play. The Londoners who are angry about injustice that's been done to them. And yet, when Sir Thomas More argues with them, he argues for their submission to authority. And yet later on, he fails to submit to authority because he refuses to sign the articles against his beliefs. The destruction of his home and his family, and ultimately himself. So what did these other contributors contribute? Chettle softens a lot of the blows. He tries to make everything a bit more palatable to the censors, dumbing down the inflammatory language. Dekker adds more complexity to the relationship between Thomas More and his wife, as well as some interesting looks into some of the more poor people. Thomas Hayward adds a lot of comic relief to try to diffuse some of the tension within the insurrection. And Shakespeare adds much more complexity to the character of Sir Thomas More, as well as complexity to the problem of xenophobia, making us think more richly and deeply about those. Plus, his writing is just leaps and bounds above everybody else's. When you get to that particular scene that Shakespeare wrote, you're like, oh yes, this is the way Shakespeare writes. Not that the other stuff is particularly bad, but, you know, it pales in comparison to Shakespeare's writing. So let's look at a summary of the text. Scene 1 begins with Doll being accosted by Debard, who has apparently already won over the goldsmith's wife, and now he wants to win over the carpenter's wife, and she refuses him. When her husband shows up, her husband is also in trouble because Cavalier has just stolen his doves. Debard and Cavalier go off to complain about these Londoners, and Doll, Lincoln, and Williamson and Sherwin all talk about the wrongs that have been done against them. Doll says, "I am ashamed that free-born Englishmen, having beaten strangers within their own bounds, should thus be braved and abused by them at home." And Lincoln decides that he's going to have sermons read, propagandizing xenophobia against these strangers and all the wrongs that they've been doing us. And then come May Day, we'll kind of rough them up a bit. George Betts says, "On May Day next in the morning we'll go forth a-maying, but make it the worst May Day for the strangers that ever they saw." Scene 2 switches gears and introduces us to Sir Thomas More, who is standing in the Sessions as Sheriff of London. And they've just shifted to more common problems, and one of those problems is petty theft. A man named Lifter is accused of lifting purses, and Justice Shrewsbury not only is suggesting capital punishment for him, but is also blaming Smart, the man who was robbed, for carrying too much money. It's basically victim blaming, saying, well, if you hadn't have been carrying that big load of cash, you wouldn't have been robbed. Thomas More thinks this is kind of ridiculous, and so he stages a little joke in which he has Lifter steal from Justice Shrewsbury. And there's this comic scene in which Lifter privately talks to Shrewsbury while picking his pocket. And then, as Shrewsbury realizes he's missing his wallet, More points out that he is guilty of the same thing that he was blaming Smart for, showing how witty and clever Thomas More is. We shift to a scene where several lords are talking about the May Day Rising and how several people are rioting in the streets. And at first the lords think we need to gather a force to stop them, but then they decide to try Thomas More and having More talk to the people. Scene 5 shows the rioters that they're preparing to burn the houses of those strangers and take them out and beat them. The mayor and Sir John Munday are responding to the riots, and they ask More to speak to the people. We finally get to scene 6, which is the real Shakespeare scene, and there we see the people in the midst of their riot. We hear some echoes perhaps of the Cade Rebellion in this scene. When the Sergeant-at-Arms Downes arrives, they attack him, but Thomas More comes in to his rescue. And More manages to reach through the crowds rioting and raging and get their attention. And then he gives a really fantastic speech. I'm going to go ahead and read it here because it's the most Shakespeare aspect of the play. "Grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies in their backs, with their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silenced by your brawl, and you in ruff of your opinions clothed. What had you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man. For other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reasons, and self-right, would shark on you, and men, like ravenous fishes, would feed on one another. So let's say that you defy authority, and you trample down authority with your raging. What do you get out of that? Well, you establish a precedence, a pattern, that anyone who rages gets what they want. And what happens when somebody rages against you? He continues a moment later, "Let me set up before your thoughts, good friends, one supposition, which, if you will mark, you shall perceive how horrible a shape your innovation bears. First, 'tis a sin, which oft the apostle did forewarn us of, urging obedience to authority. And 'twere no error, if I told you all, you were in arms 'gainst God. Nay, certainly you are, for to the king God hath his office lent of dread, of justice, power, and command, hath bid him rule, and willed you to obey. And to add ampler majesty to this, he hath not only lent the king his figure, his throne, and sword, but given him his own name, calls him a god on earth. What do you, then, rising against him that God himself installs, but rise against God? What do you to your souls in doing this? O desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you, like rebels, lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your unreverent knees make them your feet. Tell me but this, what rebel captain, as mutinies are incident, by his name can still the rout? Who will obey a traitor? Or how can well that proclamation sound, when there is no addition but a rebel to qualify a rebel? You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and lead the majesty of law in Liam to slip him like a hound. Alas, alas, say now the king, as he is clement, if the offender mourn, should so much come too short of your great trespass, as but to banish you, whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province? Spain or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England, why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that, breaking out in hideous violence, would not afford you an abode on earth, whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owed not, nor made not you, nor that the elements were not all apportionate to your comforts, but chartered unto them? What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity. You could get banished for this crime, you all know, and then you would be strangers in other countries. And then you know how you'd be treated? Like strangers. Like the way you're treating these people. Can you imagine being treated that way? Golden rule here at all? It's a fantastic speech. I love this. Treat others the way you want to be treated, even if they're foreigners, even if they're strangers. You could be in their exact same place, and then how would you feel? Notice also the way he talks about the king being put in place by God. That's certainly an idea that's going to cause attention later on in the play, when Thomas More's own beliefs cause him not to be able to sign the king's articles. There's a tension between God and your king at times. Again, it's well worth looking back at Richard II, looking back at that king having a God-given right to the throne. What does that mean? And what does it mean to challenge that right? The people submit to More, and he says he'll do everything in his power to provide them with a pardon. Afterwards, Shrewsbury shows up and right there knights Thomas More for his great work, having put down this rebellion in the name of the king. And also he is raised to Lord Chancellor for his noble act here. In the next scene, we see all of these leaders of the rebellion who are getting ready to be hanged. Lincoln, the leader of the rebellion, goes first. And he gives a final speech before he's hanged, in which he talks about how he's learned from his mistake, and he requests forgiveness from all around. And just before they continue the hangings, Surrey runs up and says, "No, no, no, we've got to stop this! Sir Thomas More begged pardon, and all of these people have been pardoned." But it's too late for Lincoln. The execution of Lincoln becomes kind of a mirror for later in the play when Thomas More is executed. We shift back to More, who's now been raised to Lord Chancellor. And at the beginning of this scene we have one more speech written by Shakespeare, in which More soliloquizes over the rise to power and the frailty of power. and he warns himself against loving power too much. Ultimately, he's definitely going to demonstrate this to the rest of the play, as he continues to care for the poor and downtrodden, and thinks very little of his own position and power. Immediately after that, there's a scene in which John Falconer comes to ask for help from him. Just as the people used to ask for help of him when he was sheriff, now some of them still want to go to him because he always cares about the poor. He makes John Falconer get a haircut, but otherwise he's willing to offer him some mercy. At dinner there's a play put on by some servants, and it's about the marriage between wit and wisdom. And when one of the players is late because he's run to the store to get a beard, Thomas More steps into the role and performs part of it. He plays the part of good counsel. There's some comedy to it, as well as emphasizing the brilliance and wit of More. More hurries on to hear the important business of the other lords, and he finds the articles from the king, which he is unwilling to sign. Because of that, he is dismissed as Lord Chancellor and sent home. The next few scenes deal with More and his family, and how they deal with his willingly stepping away from power, and giving up power for his own beliefs. It's a challenge, especially since it seems so easy to just sign the king's articles. More is always lighthearted and jovial throughout all of his griefs and struggles. And he's more concerned, it seems, for his servants. He's taught his children well and believes that they will still do what's right, but his servants will suffer most by his fall from power. Ultimately, Thomas More is arrested and taken to the Tower of London. But even on his way to the tower, the poor are calling to him, because they know he's their champion. And a poor woman asks him for help, knowing that he has some documents of hers. He tells her how he has passed those along, and now the king must be responsible for her. We have another scene in which Thomas More's servants hear how he has been arraigned and how he is going to probably be executed, but how he has also kept them in mind even now and has provided for them. We have his final goodbye with his family in the tower before he heads to his execution. And here he says he must accept the king's will to execute him, not the king's will within the articles. The final scene is his walk to his execution, where he even speaks kindly and jovially to the hangman, even though these men are grieved by the fact that they are doing this to the famous Thomas More. There's a final speech by Surrey which says, "A very learned, worthy gentleman seals error with his blood. Come, wheel to court, let sadly hints to perfect unknown fates, whilst he tends progress to the state of states." Thomas More is definitely going to heaven for all this, but at the same time, there's that sort of sense that, he should have understood his own error, maybe. Unless we're talking about the error of Henry VIII. It's a little bit fuzzy. This play, though obscure, is still a fascinating study in the way plays were written during Shakespeare's day. It's a study in some of the tensions and problems of Shakespeare's day, and the issues of censorship, how that was dealt with. Thanks for looking at it with me. I'll see you next time as we continue our study through Shakespeare's plays and works. See you then. Bye-bye.